Hello, I'm Ashley, the engineer at Andover Norton, and we've recently had a set of carburettors sent back to us from a customer who said they weren't working correctly on one side. Now these carburettors were sent back to Berlin down at Salisbury for checking and resetting. They come back, apparently they were all good and ready to go, so we sent them back to the customer who said no, exact same problems, they're not working, I can't get them working correctly, so we had them back again. This time I looked at them only to find the fuel height on one of the carburettors had not been set correctly and could never have been set correctly because the float was not working correctly in the carburettor. Now the reason it wasn't working correctly is because in this kit it tells you how high that float should be when you fit this float, the pivot pin, and one of the 3 different length needles that exist into the float bowl. Now, so when you get it into this configuration, you can actually follow the advice on the card and tip the bowl upside down, and you can see where that float sits. This one sits proud of the float bowl. Now this one doesn't look too bad, but some of them actually protrude further than the edge of the float bowl itself. This is what was happening in this carburettor. I've got a photograph here of what I actually did to test it, using a gasket on the carburettor and assembling it as if you was fitting it to your bike. I even put engineer's blue on the outer lip of the stay up float. I then assembled the carburettor, turned the carburettor upside down, turned it back up, dismantled it, only to find there's a blue witness mark on the underside of the carburettor body, which meant the float was hitting the underside of the body, and this could be preventing the actual valve from shutting off in the float bowl. Even if it's marginal and the bike's vibrating, the chances are that could be fluttering on the seat, causing you no end of problems. Now, Berlin said it's easy, the customers can bend the stainless steel tang on the float. Now, I've seen this steel bit bent all over the place. When you get them new, they look pretty straight, they're at the angle, but the actual steel piece itself looks pretty consistent. The trick to this is to bend the tang reference to the pivot point. If you bend that without the pivot piece being in there and being held securely, what you can do is bend the steel piece in relation to the float. You will get into all sorts of problems if you do that. The carburettor in question, I managed to get that into place, hold that into the float bowl, and then holding that in position, I then tried and just gently managed to tweak the tang to get it bent slightly so the float would shut the valve off sooner. I was quite surprised because when I put this back into the actual float bowl, then tipped it upside down, this sat just under flush with the edge of the float bowl. When I actually looked at how much I bent it, I couldn't see it with the naked eye. So if you can bend it and see it with the naked eye, you've most probably gone too far. You only need a very tiny amount of movement in that tang to give you your correct fuel height. I assembled the carburettor, sent them back to the customer. Hey presto, we've not heard a sausage since, so I assume it's all working. Now, that is how you set the stay up float on the pivot with the valve. The other thing some of you may get, in some of your carburettor packs, you may get a mix of aluminium needles. There's 2 different styles. We do close-ups of these, and we'll also do a brass needle. I find the brass needles a little bit heavy when you shut the float off a little too soon. So a simple change is to go from the actual brass needle to the aluminium ones. If you've got an old carburettor and got the old nylon valves, then what you could do is go straight to the aluminium ones. If you go to a brass one, it's going to most probably be too heavy. They're all different lengths. According to Berlin, they're all the same size. I've got a photograph here of them out on a square so you can see the difference. I've even sent a photograph to Berlin's and they even still say they're the same length. But they're not, because you can test them using their method in a float bowl. Now, that brings us on to the end of the actual lecture and the brief about the float height and the float bowl and how to set the tank and the different float needles. I've put here all the different part numbers of the various items that you need to actually purchase if you're ever doing this job or need new parts yourself. We'll get close-ups of these, so you'll see these in the video as well. Thank you very much. Any questions, contact myself, Andover Norton or Simon. We'll both of us be able to help you.